It lasted only 100 days. But those 100 days changed the map of the world forever. The year was 1898. The world was old and tired in some places. Empires had ruled for centuries. Spain had built one of the greatest empires in all of human history. For 400 years, Spanish ships had crossed the oceans. Spanish flags had flown over lands that most people in Europe had never even seen. Spanish soldiers had marched through jungles and deserts and mountains on the other side of the earth. Spain had built cathedrals in faraway cities. Spain had taught its language to millions of people who had never set foot on European soil. Spain was old. Spain was proud. Spain had seen everything. But in 1898, Spain was about to meet something it had not seen before. It was about to meet a young country, a loud country, a country that had not yet learned what it meant to be old. That country was the United States of America, and what happened between them in 100 days would echo through the next 100 years. To understand what happened, you have to go back. You have to stand on the island of Cuba and feel the heat. Cuba sits just 90 miles from the coast of Florida. It is a long, beautiful island. It is surrounded by warm, blue water. For centuries, Cuba belonged to Spain. It was one of Spain's most valuable places. Sugar grew there. Tobacco grew there. Ships came and went loaded with wealth. Havana, the capital city, was one of the most magnificent cities in the entire Western world. Its streets were old and grand. Its buildings rose tall and proud. Its harbor was deep and calm and full of ships. But Cuba was not happy. The Cuban people had spent decades trying to free themselves from Spanish rule. There had been one long, painful war already. It lasted 10 years, from 1868 to 1878. That war ended without real freedom. The Spanish promised changes. The changes never fully came. By the 1890s, Cuba was rising again. A new rebellion had started. A poet and thinker named José Martí had spent years outside Cuba, writing and speaking and organizing. He believed Cuba deserved to be free. He crossed back onto the island in 1895, a man on fire with purpose. He died within weeks of landing. A Spanish bullet found him in May of 1895. He was 42 years old, but his death did not kill the rebellion. It made it stronger. The Cuban fighters, called the Mambises, fought in the hills and the jungle. They knew the land. They moved fast. They struck hard. They disappeared into the trees. The Spanish commander, General Valeriano Weyler, tried to stop them. He tried very hard. He built what he called reconcentration camps. He forced Cuban civilians, ordinary people, women and children and old men, to leave their homes and move into these camps. He believed that if the fighters could not hide among the people, they could not fight. The camps were terrible places. There was not enough food. There was not enough medicine. There was no clean water. People grew sick. People died. By some counts, more than 100,000 Cubans died in those camps. Maybe more. The world was watching. And one country was watching more closely than any other. The United States of America in 1898 was a country full of energy and confusion at the same time. The Civil War had ended 33 years before. The country had survived something that should have killed it. It had come back together, slowly, painfully. In the years after the Civil War, America had changed with incredible speed. Railroads crossed the continent from coast to coast. Factories rose in the cities. Steel poured out of furnaces in Pennsylvania. Oil flowed from the ground in Texas and Ohio. Millions of people arrived from Europe, from Ireland and Italy and Poland and Russia, looking for a new life. America was growing. America was loud. America was reading newspapers. And the newspapers were telling them about Cuba. Two men in New York City were fighting each other every single day, not with fists, with newspapers. Joseph Pulitzer owned the New York World. William Randolph Hearst owned the New York Journal. They were rivals. They competed for readers. They printed bigger stories. They used bigger headlines. They pushed each other to go further and further. Cuba gave them the story they had been waiting for. The newspapers printed stories about the suffering in the camps. They printed drawings of thin, hollow-eyed Cuban women and children. They printed stories about Spanish cruelty. Some of the stories were true, some were exaggerated, some were almost entirely invented, but they were read by millions of Americans every morning over their breakfast. Americans began to feel something. They felt anger. They felt sympathy. They felt that something must be done. This kind of reporting had a name. People called it yellow journalism. It was not careful. It was not always honest. But it was very, very powerful, and it was pushing the United States toward war. There was also something else pushing America toward war. Something quieter. Something that lived not in newspapers, but in the minds of certain powerful men. Some men in America had begun to think about the future in a new way. They looked at Britain. Britain had an empire that covered a quarter of the earth. They looked at France, at Germany, at the other European powers. They were all building empires, claiming lands far from home, planting their flags and their trade routes across the world. Some Americans began to ask a question, a quiet, dangerous question. Should America do the same? One man in particular had been thinking about this for a long time. His name was Alfred Thayer Mahan. He was a naval officer and a writer. In 1890, he published a book. It was called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. It was not a simple book, but its idea was simple. Mahan argued that the great nations of history had always been the nations that controlled the seas, the nations with the strongest navies, the most ports, the best trade routes, had always won in the end. And he argued that America needed to build a great navy. America needed bases around the world. America needed to stop thinking of itself as a small country hiding behind its two oceans. His book was read by powerful people. Theodore Roosevelt read it. Roosevelt was young and ambitious and hungry for action. He believed in strength. He believed America had a destiny to be great, not just at home, but across the whole world. Roosevelt was not yet president in 1898. He was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, a smaller job, but he thought in very large ways. He began quietly preparing. He made sure the Navy was ready. He thought about where a war might happen. He thought about the Pacific, about the Philippines, about what would happen if Spain and America went to war. He sent orders to a naval commander named George Dewey. He told Dewey to be ready. President William McKinley sat in the White House and did not want war. McKinley was a careful man. He had fought in the Civil War as a young soldier. He had seen what war actually looked like, up close. He had seen men die. He did not romanticize it. He did not want to send American boys into another war if there was any other way. He tried diplomacy. He sent messages to Spain. He asked Spain to ease its treatment of the Cubans. Spain, nervous and aware that American pressure was growing, made some small concessions. General Weyler was recalled. The reconcentration camps were officially softened, though the suffering continued. Spain even offered to give Cuba a kind of limited self-rule. McKinley watched and waited. He hoped the situation might improve without a shot being fired. Then something happened that changed everything. The USS Maine was an American battleship. It was not the largest or the most powerful ship in the American Navy, but it was an important ship. In January of 1898, amid rising tensions, it was sent to Havana Harbor. Officially, this was called a friendly visit. The American government said it was simply there to protect American citizens living in Cuba if the situation became dangerous. Spain accepted the visit without open protest. But nobody was comfortable. A large American warship sitting in the harbor of a Spanish colonial city was not exactly a sign of friendship. It was a message, a quiet, floating message. The Maine sat in the harbor through the warm January nights and into February. On the night of February 15, 1898, at 9:40 in the evening, Havana Harbor exploded. The Maine blew up. The explosion was enormous. It killed 266 American sailors. In an instant, the ship sank quickly. The harbor glowed with fire. Men who survived the blast jumped into the water. The night filled with smoke and screaming and confusion. Nobody knew what had caused the explosion. The cause of the explosion has been studied for over 100 years and is still debated by historians. At the time, a naval investigation concluded that an external explosion, possibly a mine, had caused the disaster. Spain denied any involvement. A later investigation in 1974 suggested the explosion may have been internal, possibly caused by a fire near the ammunition storage area. In 1998, another study pointed back toward an external cause. The truth is that we do not know. We have never known for certain. But in 1898, the newspapers did not wait for the truth. The headline in Hearst's New York Journal screamed the answer before anyone had finished investigating. "Remember the Maine!" became a battle cry. The Journal and papers across the country told their readers that Spain had killed American sailors. American blood had been spilled. Something had to be done. The pressure on McKinley became almost impossible to resist. He still tried. He sent an ultimatum to Spain in late March. He demanded that Spain agree to a ceasefire in Cuba, close the reconcentration camps, and accept American arbitration, meaning that America would help decide the outcome. Spain, caught between its own pride and the fear of war, moved slowly and responded in ways that were almost enough but not quite. On April 11, 1898, McKinley went to Congress and asked for authority to use military force to end the conflict in Cuba. Congress responded with a roar. But before they declared war, Congress did something interesting, something that matters. They passed a resolution. It was called the Teller Amendment. Senator Henry Teller of Colorado stood up and insisted that it be included. The amendment said clearly that the United States had no intention of exercising control over Cuba. It said that once the war was over and Cuba was free, the United States would leave. The United States was going to war not for conquest, not for empire, but for freedom. That is what it said. It passed overwhelmingly. Americans believed it. McKinley signed it. And in that moment, the United States officially declared that this was a war for liberty, not for land. Spain saw what was coming. On April 23rd, Spain declared war on the United States. On April 25th, the United States declared war on Spain. The 100 days had begun. Now, something strange and wonderful and world-changing happened. It happened not in Cuba, not in the Caribbean. It happened on the other side of the earth. It happened in Manila Bay, in the Philippines. Those quiet orders that Theodore Roosevelt had sent to Commodore George Dewey back in February had not been forgotten. Dewey had been waiting, his ships ready, his crews prepared. He was in Hong Kong when the war officially started. British neutrality rules required him to leave the port. He left. He sailed toward the Philippines. The Philippines were a Spanish colony, an archipelago of thousands of islands in the Pacific Ocean, thousands of miles from Cuba, thousands of miles from Spain, and thousands of miles from America. Spain had ruled the Philippines for over 300 years. The Spanish presence there was old and deep. Manila was a grand colonial city. Spain had a naval fleet in Manila Bay. It was commanded by Admiral Patricio Montojo. His ships were not in great condition. Some were old, some needed repair. But they were there, and they flew the Spanish flag, and they were all Spain had defended its Pacific Empire. Dewey arrived at night. He moved his fleet quietly past the Spanish shore batteries in the dark hours before dawn. The shore guns fired. Some shells landed near his ships. None of them struck. He waited until there was just enough light. At 5:41 in the morning on May 1st, 1898, Dewey turned to his flag captain and spoke one of the most famous sentences in American naval history. He said, "You may fire when you are ready, Gridley." The American fleet opened fire on the Spanish ships. What followed was not a battle in any traditional sense. It was something closer to an execution. The American ships were newer. Their guns were better. Their crews were trained. The Spanish ships, anchored or moving slowly in the shallow water, had almost no chance. In a few hours, the Spanish fleet in Manila Bay was destroyed. Every Spanish ship was sunk, damaged beyond repair, or captured. The Spanish lost more than 300 men killed and wounded. The Americans lost one man. One man died, not from enemy fire, but from heat stroke in the engine room. Dewey had destroyed the Spanish Pacific Fleet in a single morning. America had just won its first great victory of the war, and had done so not in the Caribbean, but in Asia, in a place most Americans could not even find on a map. The news traveled by telegraph across the Pacific and across the continent. When it reached Washington, it caused a sensation. Roosevelt, The man who had set this in motion was wild with excitement. He resigned from his Navy desk job almost immediately. He was going to find his own war. He was going to Cuba. But back in Washington, something else was happening. Something that Dewey's stunning victory had created without anyone quite planning for it. America now controlled Manila Bay. American warships sat in the harbor of the Philippine capital. The Spanish army still held Manila itself. The Filipino people, who had been fighting their own rebellion against Spain, were watching carefully. Their leader was a young man named Emilio Aguinaldo. He was 28 years old. He had been fighting Spain for 2 years already. The Spanish had forced him into exile in Hong Kong with a financial agreement to leave. But now, the United States brought him back. American officials met with him. They encouraged him to resume his fight. They suggested, though never in writing, that the Philippines might gain independence when the war was over. Aguinaldo believed them. He rallied his fighters. The Filipino rebels, with American support, quickly seized most of the Philippine countryside. By June, Aguinaldo declared Philippine independence. A new flag was raised. A national anthem was played for the first time. A republic was declared. Aguinaldo believed the Americans were allies. He believed they had come to help his people be free, just as they claimed to be freeing Cuba. He did not yet understand what was coming. Back in the Caribbean, the war moved with remarkable speed. The United States Army in 1898 was not the massive military force it would one day become. It was small. It was not well organized for a sudden large war. The regular army had fewer than 30,000 men. They would need more. Volunteers poured in from across the country. Men who wanted adventure. Men who believed in the cause. Men who simply wanted to be part of something big. All rushed to enlist. One group of volunteers became the most famous soldiers of the entire war. Theodore Roosevelt, freshly resigned from his Navy post, recruited and helped organize a regiment of cavalry volunteers. They were a remarkable collection of men. There were Ivy League athletes, college men who had road crew and played polo. There were cowboys from the Western Territories. There were ranchers and hunters and rough riders from places like New Mexico and Arizona and Oklahoma. There were even some Native American soldiers among them. The newspapers loved them. They were perfect for the age of yellow journalism. They were colorful and dramatic, and led by the most colorful, dramatic man in American public life. The press called them the Rough Riders. Roosevelt did not officially command them. That honor went to Leonard Wood, a trained military officer. But everyone knew who the real personality of the regiment was. Roosevelt burned with energy. He could not sit still. He had wanted this war. He had helped make it happen. And now he was going to be in it. Getting to Cuba was harder than anyone planned. The American military buildup happened in Tampa, Florida. Tampa was chosen because it was close to Cuba. But Tampa in the summer of 1898 was not ready for an army. The heat was crushing. The organization was poor. There was confusion about which units would board which ships. There was not enough food. There was not enough water. There were not enough horses. Men waited in the Florida sun for weeks, getting sick from the heat and from bad water and from diseases that spread quickly in the crowded camps. Yellow fever was everywhere. More Americans would eventually die in Cuba from disease than from Spanish bullets. But the army moved. In mid-June, a large American force sailed from Tampa. 17,000 men, dozens of ships. They crossed the 90 miles of water between Florida and Cuba. They landed at a place called Daiquiri on June 22, 1898. The landing was disorganized and chaotic. Horses were thrown overboard and left to swim to shore. Equipment was scattered, but the Spanish did not attack during the landing. They had pulled their forces back. The Americans were on Cuban soil. The Spanish forces in Cuba were commanded by General Arsenio Linares. He had fewer men than the Americans. He knew he was in a difficult situation. Spain was far away. Reinforcements were not coming fast enough. His soldiers were tired and sick with tropical diseases too. But he had one significant advantage. He had chosen his positions carefully. He occupied the high ground between the American landing zone and the city of Santiago de Cuba, where the Spanish fleet was sheltering in the harbor there was a ridge. The ridge was called San Juan Heights. At one end of the ridge was a fortified position called El Caney. At the other end, just in front of the main ridge, was a small rise called Kettle Hill. The Americans would have to take that high ground if they wanted to reach Santiago. July 1st, 1898. The air was thick with tropical heat and humidity. The jungle pressing on all sides. The Americans moved up toward the ridge in long columns at El Caney. American forces under General Henry Lawton attacked a small Spanish fort defended by fewer than 600 soldiers. The plan was for this to be a quick operation, finished in a couple of hours. Instead, the 500 or so determined Spanish defenders held out for the entire day. They fought with incredible courage against a force many times their size. The battle lasted hours longer than anyone expected. Meanwhile, other American forces moved toward Kettle Hill and the main San Juan Heights beyond. They came out of the jungle and into the open ground at the base of the hills. The Spanish on top had clear lines of fire. They had modern German-made rifles. They used smokeless powder, which meant the Americans often could not see where the fire was coming from. The Spanish fire was accurate and constant. American soldiers fell in the tall grass. They could not stay there. The only choice was forward. The charge up San Juan Heights is one of the most famous moments in American military history. Roosevelt and his Rough Riders were there. They had lost their horses in the confusion of landing, so the cavalry was fighting on foot. Roosevelt himself had managed to borrow a horse. He rode back and forth, visible, impossible to miss, urging his men forward. The charge was not one clean, organized movement. It was a surge. American soldiers from several different units, regular Army men and volunteers, African-American soldiers of the famous Buffalo Soldier regiments alongside white soldiers, all moved together up the hill. The Buffalo Soldiers deserve more attention than history has sometimes given them. The 9th and 10th Cavalry, made up of black American soldiers led mostly by white officers, fought with extraordinary bravery that day. They helped anchor the assault. They pushed up the hill under the same fire, through the same heat, suffering the same losses. Some historians have argued that without the contribution of the Buffalo Soldiers, the charge might have failed. Roosevelt reached the top of Kettle Hill on his horse. The Spanish defenders pulled back to the main line. He waited briefly for orders or for the advance to continue, then pushed forward again with his men toward the main San Juan Heights. By late afternoon, the heights were taken. The Americans stood on top of the ridge and looked down toward Santiago and its harbor. Below them, they could see the Spanish fleet. Admiral Pascual Cervera had known for weeks that he was in an impossible position. He had brought a Spanish naval squadron across the Atlantic. His fleet was not in good condition when it left Spain. Equipment was worn. Ammunition was limited. Morale was uncertain. He had sailed into Santiago Harbor in mid-May, and there he had been trapped. The American Navy, under Admiral William Sampson, had placed its ships outside the harbor entrance. They were blockading the port. Cervera could not leave without fighting his way through. And fighting his way through, with his fleet in the condition it was in, seemed like suicide. He sent messages to his superiors in Spain. He told them exactly what he believed. He told them that attempting to break out of Santiago Harbor meant certain destruction. His superiors understood the military reality. But they were also thinking about politics, about national pride, about what it would look like if the fleet stayed in harbor and surrendered without a fight. They ordered Cervera to leave the harbor and fight. On the morning of July 3rd, 1898, Cervera obeyed. His ships came out of Santiago Harbor one by one, steaming as fast as their worn engines could carry them, trying to run westward along the coast. The American fleet was waiting. What followed was not really a naval battle either. It was a destruction. The American ships were faster, better maintained, and better armed. One by one, the Spanish ships were hammered by American gunfire, caught fire, and ran themselves aground on the Cuban coast to avoid sinking in the deep water. Sailors jumped into the sea. Some made it to shore. Some drowned. Within a few hours, the entire Spanish Atlantic squadron had been destroyed. Cervera himself survived. He was rescued from the water by American sailors who pulled him aboard, soaking wet and alone, one of the last acts of the battle. He was treated with great respect. He was a dignified man who had done his duty knowing it was hopeless, and the Americans recognized that. The Battle of Santiago Bay effectively ended the naval war. Spain had nothing left in the Caribbean. Santiago itself surrendered on July 17, 1898. The siege had been difficult. American forces, now on the high ground, had the city in their sights. Disease, especially yellow fever, was devastating the American army. Generals worried that they might lose more men to sickness than to the Spanish. The situation was urgent. Negotiations went back and forth. Spanish pride made everything slower and more complicated. But on July 17th, the white flag went up over Santiago. The Spanish commander formally surrendered the city and the remaining Spanish forces in the eastern part of Cuba. American soldiers marched into Santiago. It was a moment of triumph. Bands played. Flags were raised. But the men who raised those flags were tired and pale and sick. The heat and the disease had taken a terrible toll. The army would face a public health crisis in the weeks that followed, as thousands of men came home ill with tropical fevers. There was also a moment at the Santiago surrender that revealed something about the character of this war and what it would become. The Cuban rebel fighters, the Mombises, the men who had been fighting for their freedom for years, who had fought alongside the Americans, were not invited to the formal surrender ceremony. They were kept outside. The city was handed from Spain to the United States, not to the Cubans, not to the people whose country it was. Some Cubans noticed. Some of them felt the first cold shadow of what might be coming. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, the situation was also developing quickly, and in ways that would matter for a very long time. After Dewey's victory in Manila Bay, the American Navy controlled the waters around the Philippines. American reinforcements arrived through June and July. By August, American ground forces were strong enough to move on Manila itself. On August 13th, 1898, American forces, with Filipino rebel forces alongside them, captured Manila from the Spanish. But here something strange happened. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, the situation was also developing quickly, and in ways that would matter for a very long time. After Dewey's victory in Manila Bay, the American Navy controlled the waters around the Philippines. American reinforcements arrived through June and July. By August, American ground forces were strong enough to move on Manila itself. On August 13th, 1898, American forces, with Filipino rebel forces alongside them, captured Manila from the Spanish. But here something strange happened. The Spanish commander, General Fermin Jardines, secretly communicated with American commanders. He was willing to surrender, but he would only surrender to the Americans. He would not surrender to the Filipino rebels. In his mind, surrendering to Filipinos was beneath the dignity of a Spanish officer. He wanted to arrange a mock battle, a stage fight, just enough to satisfy the requirements of military honor, and then give the city to the Americans. The Americans agreed to this arrangement. The battle was performed. It was mostly theater. Spanish soldiers fired briefly. American soldiers advanced. The Spanish surrender was received by the Americans. Aguinaldo and his Filipino forces were excluded. They were not allowed into Manila, the city that the Filipinos had helped capture. The city at the center of the country they believed they were about to be free was handed to the Americans, and the Filipinos were left outside the walls. Aguinaldo stood outside Manila and began to understand that something had gone wrong. The formal end of the Spanish-American War came quickly after that. Spain knew it was finished. The fleet was gone. Cuba was lost. The Philippines had fallen. Puerto Rico, another Spanish colony in the Caribbean, had been taken in a quick campaign at the end of July, almost without resistance. Spain had lost everything. All that remained was to negotiate the terms. On August 12, 1898, an armistice was signed. The fighting officially stopped. Then came the long months of negotiations. The two sides met in Paris. American diplomats and Spanish diplomats sat across tables in a grand city far from any of the battlefields and worked out the shape of the new world. The Treaty of Paris was signed on December 10th, 1898. Its terms were stark. Spain gave up Cuba. Cuba was to become independent, though under American oversight. Spain gave Puerto Rico to the United States. Puerto Rico became American territory. Spain gave Guam, a small island in the Pacific, to the United States. And Spain gave the Philippines to the United States. In exchange, the United States paid Spain $20 million. The Philippines were not won in battle alone. They were purchased for $20 million, a transaction, a line in a treaty, the future of 8 million people decided in a Paris room. The 100 days were over, but what they had created was just beginning. Look at what happened in those 100 days and try to see it clearly. The United States went to war in April as a country that had always officially rejected the idea of empire. It came out of that war in December as the owner of territories in the Caribbean and the Pacific. It had bases. It had ports. It had people. Millions of people who had not chosen to be under American rule, but suddenly found themselves there. Some Americans celebrated. Theodore Roosevelt, back from Cuba, and already the most famous man in the country, was thrilled. He believed this was America's destiny. He believed the country had proven itself on the world stage. He believed the war had been good, necessary, and right. Other Americans were deeply troubled. A movement called the Anti-Imperialist League was forming even before the Treaty of Paris was signed. It included some of the most respected names in American life. Mark Twain, the great writer and storyteller, who had made Americans laugh and think for decades, joined it. He was furious. He wrote essays full of cutting, dark humor about what America had done and what it was becoming. He could not make peace with the idea that a country born in revolution against empire was now building one of its own. Andrew Carnegie, one of the wealthiest men in America, was against the empire too. He even offered to personally pay the $20 million to give the Philippines their independence, if that is what it took. The offer was refused. The debate in the Senate over ratifying the Treaty of Paris was fierce. It passed, but not by much. The margin was very narrow. America chose empire by the smallest possible majority. And then the promise made to the Philippines was broken. In the early months of 1899, it became clear to Emilio Aguinaldo and to the Filipino people that the United States had no intention of granting independence. American officials and politicians spoke about the Filipinos in ways that were deeply condescending. They said the Filipinos were not ready to govern themselves. They said the Philippines needed American guidance and education and civilization before self-rule could be considered. President McKinley himself said that he had prayed about the decision. He said that in his prayers, he had received the answer that America must keep the Philippines, must educate and uplift the Filipino people, and must prepare them for self-government in the future at some unspecified time, on terms the Americans would decide. Aguinaldo had fought for independence. He had watched his people die for independence. He had believed American promises. He was not going to accept this. On February 4th, 1899, fighting broke out between American and Filipino forces near Manila. The Philippine-American War had begun. It would last for years. Some historians say the main war ended in 1902, when Aguinaldo was captured. Others point to continued resistance that lasted until 1913. The war was brutal. American soldiers, some of whom had been volunteers inspired by the ideals of freeing Cuba, found themselves fighting Filipino villagers in a jungle war they did not always understand. Atrocities were committed on both sides. Water torture, burning of villages, killing of prisoners. Methods that shocked some Americans back home when the news reached them. By the time the Philippine-American War was over, estimates suggest somewhere between 200,000 and 1 million Filipinos had died. The range in the numbers reflects how difficult it is to count deaths in a long guerrilla war, and also how easily history can look away from uncomfortable truths. America had fought a war for freedom, and then begun another war to deny it. Cuba's story was different from the Philippines, but it was also complicated. The Teller Amendment had said America would leave Cuba alone when the war was over, and America did eventually allow Cuba to become formally independent. But the road to that independence had conditions attached. In 1901, before American troops would leave Cuba, the Cuban government was required to add something to its constitution. It was called the Platt Amendment. The Platt Amendment said that Cuba could not make treaties with foreign powers without American approval. It said Cuba could not go into debt beyond certain limits. It said the United States had the right to intervene in Cuban affairs to preserve order and Cuban independence. And it said Cuba had to lease land to the United States for naval stations. One of those leased naval stations was a place called Guantanamo Bay. The United States signed a lease for Guantanamo Bay in 1903. The terms of the lease said it would last as long as the United States needed it or until both sides agreed to end it. The annual payment was originally around $4,000 in gold. Cuba stopped cashing those checks after the 1959 revolution, but the Americans never left. Guantanamo Bay is still an American naval base today. More than 125 years later, the lease that grew out of the 100 days of 1898 still holds a piece of Cuban land in American hands. Puerto Rico went differently again. Puerto Rico became an unincorporated territory of the United States. That status has a meaning that took years of legal battles to define. The Supreme Court of the United States, in a series of decisions called the Insular Cases, ruled in the early 1900s that the Constitution did not fully apply in these new territories. People there were not automatically full American citizens. They were in a kind of middle category. Puerto Ricans became American citizens in 1917, just in time to be drafted into the First World War, but they still could not vote for president. Their representation in Congress was limited. Their relationship with the United States remained complicated and contested. More than a century later, Puerto Rico's political status is still debated. Some people in Puerto Rico want statehood. Some want independence. Some want the current arrangement to continue. The island still carries the unresolved questions of 1898. Now step back from the individual islands and see the whole picture. Before 1898, the United States had no overseas empire to speak of. It had territories in North America, land it had taken from native peoples and from Mexico and from other neighbors over the decades. But it did not have island territories in the Caribbean and the Pacific. It did not have a network of naval bases stretching across the globe. It did not think of itself as a Pacific power. After 1898, everything was different. The United States controlled Puerto Rico. It controlled Guam. It controlled the Philippines. It had a permanent naval base at Guantanamo. It had a commanding position in the Caribbean, and its navy was now one that the rest of the world took seriously. The Pacific was no longer an ocean that separated America from Asia. It was a sea that America now had the power to cross and control. The naval base at Manila made America a Pacific neighbor of China and Japan, and the rest of Asia, in a way it had never been before. Japan was watching. Japan was building its own empire in Asia. Japan was thinking about the Pacific too. The collision between American Pacific power and Japanese Pacific power would eventually come, decades later, at a place called Pearl Harbor. But the roots of that collision were planted in 1898, in the 100 days when America first reached across the ocean and grabbed the Philippines. The men who had made the war possible scattered into history after 1898 and left their marks in very different ways. William Randolph Hearst built an even larger media empire. He became one of the most powerful men in American journalism and politics for the next several decades. His newspapers continued to shape what millions of Americans thought about the world. He became famous not just for yellow journalism, but for the extraordinary life he lived, the castle he built in California, the art he collected, the power he wielded. He became the inspiration, many years later, for one of the most celebrated films ever made. Joseph Pulitzer also continued in newspapers. He eventually endowed a journalism school at Columbia University and established the Pulitzer Prizes, awarded every year to the best in American journalism and literature. The prizes bear his name, the name of a man who helped teach America what journalism could do, for better and for worse. Theodore Roosevelt went from Cuba to the governorship of New York, then to the vice presidency, then, after McKinley was assassinated in 1901, to the presidency itself. He was 42 years old when he became president, the youngest in American history. He was exactly who he had always seemed to be, energetic, aggressive, full of ideas, full of contradictions. He built the Panama Canal. He won the Nobel Peace Prize. He expanded the national parks. He broke up monopolies. He was a conservationist and an imperialist, a progressive and a militarist, all at the same time. He never stopped believing that the Spanish-American War had been right and good. McKinley himself did not live to see much of what his war had created. He was shot at an exposition in Buffalo, New York, in September 1901, by a young man with a grievance against authority. He died 8 days later. He is remembered less clearly than many presidents, often overshadowed by the volcanic personality of Roosevelt, who followed him. George Dewey became the greatest naval hero of his generation. America made him an admiral of the Navy, a rank created specifically for him, a rank no one else in American history has held before or since at that level. He was celebrated everywhere he went. His name was given to cities and counties and streets across the country. He briefly and somewhat mysteriously allowed his name to be mentioned as a possible presidential candidate in 1900, then withdrew from consideration almost as quickly as the idea arose. Emilio Aguinaldo was captured in 1901 by American forces through a clever deception. Afterward, he swore allegiance to the United States and largely withdrew from active politics for decades. During the Second World War, he collaborated with the Japanese occupiers of the Philippines, which damaged his reputation severely. He lived until 1964, long enough to see the Philippines gain the independence he had fought for as a young man. The independence that had been denied him for half a century. Valeriano Weyler, the Spanish general whose reconcentration camps had shocked the world, returned to Spain and continued to serve in the military for years. He later served as a minister of war. History judged him harshly for Cuba. He died in 1930. The war left something in American culture that did not disappear. Before 1898, Americans generally believed their country should stay out of the affairs of the rest of the world. This was called isolationism, though the word was not yet common. The idea came from George Washington himself, who in his farewell address had warned against entangling alliances with foreign nations. America was protected by its oceans. It could grow and prosper without getting involved in the endless wars and politics of Europe and Asia. After 1898, that idea was permanently weakened. America had tasted something. It had felt the excitement of a successful war. It had watched its flag rise over distant cities. It had read about naval victories in Manila and cavalry charges in Cuba. It had experienced the complicated emotions of winning, and it had built the structures that would keep it involved. Bases, territories, trade routes, military commitments, entanglements. Each entanglement called for more. Each commitment created new ones. The United States would try to step back from the world during certain periods. After the First World War, it retreated into something like isolationism again for a time, but it never went all the way back. The infrastructure of overseas power that began in 1898 kept pulling the country outward. By the time the Second World War came, America was not really a reluctant world power any longer. It was the world's most powerful nation, whether it wanted to admit it or not. And when Pearl Harbor happened, when Japan struck the American Pacific Fleet in December 1941, it struck at the very position in the Pacific that America had built from the ruins of the Spanish Empire in 1898. There is something else worth understanding about those 100 days. The war revealed what America wanted to believe about itself, and the gap between that belief and reality. America told itself it was fighting for freedom. It passed the Teller Amendment and meant it, at least partly. Most Americans genuinely believed they were helping Cuba. They felt real sympathy for the people in the reconcentration camps. The Rough Riders and the Buffalo Soldiers charged up that hill in genuine belief that they were on the right side. But America also told itself stories that were not true. The newspapers had lied about the Maine. Many of the stories about Spanish cruelty were exaggerated. The idea that Cuba and the Philippines needed American guidance and supervision before they could be trusted with their own futures was condescending and self-serving. The treatment of Aguinaldo and the Filipino people, the broken promises, the brutal war that followed, none of that matched the story America was telling about itself. This tension between what America believed about itself and what it actually did is not unique to 1898. It runs through much of American history. But 1898 is a moment when the tension became very visible very quickly. The Teller Amendment and the Platt Amendment, one promising freedom and the other limiting it, exist in the same historical moment, barely 2 years apart. America was genuinely committed to certain values, And America was also genuinely tempted by power. Both things were true at the same time. That is not comfortable, but it is honest. The war also revealed something about how modern countries go to war, something that is still relevant today. Before 1898, no major American war had been driven so heavily by the power of the press. Newspapers had existed during the Civil War, of course, but they did not have the reach or the influence of Hearst and Pulitzer's papers at the end of the century. The telegraph made instant communication possible. The railroads distributed newspapers to every corner of the country. Printing technology had improved so that millions of copies could be produced cheaply. For the first time, a large portion of the American population was reading the same stories at roughly the same time. This was a new kind of power, the power to shape what millions of people believed was happening in the world, to decide what they were angry about, to decide who the enemy was, to decide when something was outrageous enough to require action. Hearst and Pulitzer used that power aggressively. They were not agents of any government. They were not even especially coordinated with each other. They were simply competing for readers and profit. But the result of their competition, the drumbeat of stories about Spanish cruelty and the death of Maine and the suffering of the Cubans, helped move the most powerful nation in the Western Hemisphere toward war. The question of who controls the story and what happens when the story is wrong is not a question from the past. It has only become more urgent in a world where information moves faster than ever before and where the power to shape millions of minds is more widely distributed than it has ever been. The Spanish-American War also changed Spain. The loss of Cuba and Puerto Rico and the Philippines and Guam was devastating for Spain, not just militarily, not just economically. It struck at something deeper, at the idea of what Spain was. For 4 centuries, Spain had been an empire. Empire was part of its identity, part of its pride, part of the story it told itself about its place in history. The loss of the last significant pieces of that empire, lost quickly, lost embarrassingly, to a young country that had barely existed for a little over a century, was a profound national shock. The generation of Spanish writers and thinkers who came of age in the years around 1898 are known in Spanish history as the generation of 98. They wrote and thought deeply about what had happened to their country. They asked hard questions about Spain's identity, about its future, about what it meant to be Spanish in a world where Spain was no longer great in the old way. Some of the most important works in modern Spanish literature and philosophy came out of this reckoning. The wound of 1898 pushed some of Spain's best minds to think more clearly and more honestly about themselves and their country than they might have otherwise. Pain sometimes makes people more thoughtful. And Cuba. What happened to Cuba after the war? Cuba got its formal independence in 1902. American troops left. A Cuban government was established. The Cuban flag flew over Havana. In a certain narrow sense, the thing that the Cuban fighters had bled for across decades was achieved. But the Platt Amendment shadowed everything. American companies moved into Cuba in large numbers after independence. They bought land. They built sugar plantations and refineries. They invested in tobacco. They ran utilities and railroads. The Cuban economy became deeply intertwined with American money and American interests in ways that gave American businesses and the American government enormous influence over Cuban affairs. The United States intervened militarily in Cuba multiple times in the years after independence, not conquering it, but sending troops to restore order during political crises, exercising the intervention rights the Platt Amendment had created. Cuba became technically independent, but practically subject to enormous American influence. The relationship was not between equals. It could not be, given the difference in size and power and wealth. This situation continued through the first half of the 20th century. American business interests thrived in Cuba. Cuban politics was turbulent, often corrupt, heavily influenced by who Washington favored or disfavored. In 1959, a revolution changed everything. Fidel Castro led a guerrilla movement that overthrew the existing government. He was not initially a declared communist, but he became one. He nationalized American businesses. He ended the Platt Amendment arrangement. He created a government that was deeply hostile to the United States. The United States responded with decades of hostility in return: an embargo, a failed invasion at the Bay of Pigs, assassination attempts, decades of Cold War in the Caribbean. The complicated, painful relationship between Cuba and the United States that erupted in 1898 has not been fully resolved to this day. The roots of it go all the way back to those 100 days. What does it mean that it all happened so fast? 100 days. A few months in summer. Some naval battles, mostly one-sided. A cavalry charge up a Cuban hill. A treaty negotiated in Paris in autumn. And yet the consequences unfolded across the next 100 years. The Philippines under American rule for nearly 50 years. Independence finally granted in 1946. Puerto Rico still an unresolved question a century later. Guantanamo Bay still in American hands. The Pacific naval presence that contributed to the collision with Japan in 1941. The Philippine-American War, one of the most brutal conflicts in American history, one that most Americans have largely forgotten. The story of those 100 days is a story about how quickly the world can change, about how a single summer can redirect the entire flow of history. It is also a story about how the changes made in great hurry, with great confidence, and sometimes great carelessness, can take generations to understand and longer still to resolve. There are people today in the Philippines who know the story of Aguinaldo and the broken promises. There are people in Puerto Rico who still debate what their relationship with the United States should be. There are people in Cuba who live with the consequence of everything that 1898 set in motion. There are families in Spain who grew up with the story of what was lost, the family pride that was wounded, the empire that vanished. And there are Americans, many Americans, who do not know much about any of it. The Spanish-American War is not one of the wars that gets taught in detail in American schools. It sits between the more famous conflicts after the Civil War, before the World Wars, and it is easy to skip over. It does not have a famous battlefield the way Gettysburg does. It does not have a famous ending the way the Second World War does. But its consequences are everywhere, if you know where to look. Every time an American politician talks about the United States as a Pacific power, the roots of that idea run back to 1898. Every time someone debates the status of Puerto Rico, they are debating the unfinished business of 1898. Every time an American news story shapes public opinion about a foreign conflict, there is an echo of Hearst and Pulitzer. Every time the United States wrestles with the contradiction between its ideals and its actions overseas, it is wrestling with a question that was clearly posed for the first time in the summer of 1898. The 100 days also changed how America thought about its military. Before the war, the American Navy was not particularly impressive by world standards. Alfred Thayer had argued for building it up, and some building had been done through the 1880s and 1890s. But the war proved the argument in a way that no book could. Dewey in Manila Bay, Sampson destroying Cervera's fleet at Santiago. These victories show what a well-trained, well-equipped modern Navy could do. The lesson was taken seriously. In the years after 1898, the United States invested heavily in its naval forces. The Navy grew in size and in ambition. New battleships were laid down. New tactics were developed. New bases were established across the Pacific. By the time Theodore Roosevelt became president, he had the Navy he had always wanted. He sent 16 American battleships on a world tour in 1907 and 1908 to show what America now was. The fleet was painted white. People called it the Great White Fleet. It stopped in ports around the world. It was a message, a quiet, floating message. The same kind the Maine had been, but much, much larger. The world took note. One more thing needs to be said about those 100 days, and it is perhaps the hardest thing. The war exposed the racial ideas that shaped how America thought about the rest of the world. Men who argue for taking the Philippines talk about the Filipino people in ways that reflected the racial thinking of their time. McKinley talked about lifting them up and civilizing them. Others were blunter. They spoke of inferior peoples who needed to be guided by superior ones. They spoke of the white man's burden, a phrase taken from a poem by Rudyard Kipling published in 1899, which argued there was a duty and destiny of white Western nations to govern and educate the darker peoples of the world. These ideas were wrong. They were wrong then, even if many people at the time did not recognize it. They caused enormous harm. They gave cover to policies that killed hundreds of thousands of people in the Philippines and denied self-determination to people who were perfectly capable of governing themselves. And these ideas sat alongside the genuine idealism that also existed in 1898. Both things were true at the same time. Americans who sincerely believed in freedom for Cuba could also simultaneously believe that Filipinos were not ready for it. The contradictions lived inside the same people, the same speeches, the same decisions. That is not unusual in history, but it is important to see clearly. It is important not to flatten the story into simple heroism or simple villainy. The men of 1898 were human beings with the capacities and the blindnesses of their time. Some of what they did was genuinely heroic. Some of what they did was genuinely wrong. The record holds both. The Cuban people had been fighting for their freedom for 30 years before American ships arrived. The Filipino people had built a revolutionary government and declared independence before American forces captured Manila. These were not helpless peoples waiting to be rescued or guided. They were peoples in the middle of their own histories, their own struggles, their own determination to shape their own futures. The Spanish-American War interrupted those histories. It redirected them. It substituted one outside power for another for a time. But it could not stop them forever. Cuba eventually made its own revolution, for better or worse on its own terms. The Philippines eventually gained independence. Puerto Rico continues to define its own identity. The people who lived in the places touched by those 100 days did not become merely the objects of other people's decisions. They remained the subjects of their own histories, however much outside forces tried to determine their fates. The summer of 1898 ended with the flags of a new empire flying over islands in the Caribbean and the Pacific. The men who raised those flags believed they were doing something great and necessary. Some of what they believed was true. The war did end the suffering in Cuba under Spanish rule. It did end Spain's long colonial presence in places where it had become cruel and extractive. It did demonstrate American power in ways that changed the world's understanding of what the United States was and could be. It did produce genuine moments of courage, from the Buffalo Soldiers on the hills of Cuba to Dewey sailors in Manila Bay. But some of what they believed was not true. The war did not simply bring freedom. It brought one kind of control in place of another, at least for a time. It broke promises. It caused wars. It set in motion conflicts that lasted for decades. That is the full picture. That is the complicated, human, irreducible truth of those 100 days. History does not give us clean stories. It gives us real ones. The Spanish-American War was not a story of pure heroism or pure villainy. It was a story of a young country, full of energy and idealism and ambition, stepping onto a world stage it had been approaching for decades, doing some things it could be proud of and some things it would struggle to justify, and permanently changing its place in the world in the process. It was a war that lasted 100 days and left consequences that lasted 100 years and more. It was a war that showed how fast the world can change when great forces collide. It was a war about freedom and empire, and about the uncomfortable fact that those two things are not always as different from each other as we would like to believe. The harbor at Havana is quiet now. The water is still warm and blue. Old Spanish buildings still stand in the city. In Manila, the old walled city called Intramuros still carries the marks of its Spanish past. In Puerto Rico, the great Spanish Fort El Morro still stands at the entrance to San Juan Harbor, built to defend against enemies that came from the sea, watching still. The USS Maine has never been fully recovered from the bottom of Havana Harbor. Some of its parts were raised long ago, but much of it remains where it sank, deep in the mud, on the night of February 15, 1898. The cause of the explosion has still never been definitively proven. The one question that started everything still has no final answer. Maybe that is the most honest symbol of those 100 days. A ship at the bottom of a harbor. A question without an answer. A world changed beyond recognition by something that began in mystery. The 100 days are over, but what they built and what they broke and what they left unfinished is still with us. It will be with us for a long time yet. 100 days, one summer, one world changed. And at the center of it all, a young country that had always told itself it was different from the empires it had escaped. discovering for the first time that power has its own gravity, and that no country, however strong its ideals, is entirely immune to what it offers. That is the story of 1898. That is the story of the 100 days that built an empire and broke a promise and set the course of the next century. It began with an explosion in a harbor. It ended with a signature in Paris. And the echo of it is still moving to the world, finding us wherever we are, asking us questions we have not yet fully answered.